Hello friends and Happy New Year! Today we're going to be talking about my 10 favourite books from 2022. Well, kind of, anyway. A couple of disclaimers before we start. In December, I did do 3 videos talking about my favourite junior fiction, middle fiction, and YA titles. And some of those are what I would consider favourites of the year overall. But I've already spoken about them. In this video, I just want to focus on adult fiction. And to be perfectly honest, this list was probably the hardest to put together. So instead of focusing on like my favourites of the year, instead how I decided to think of this was the books that have stayed with me. So some of these I actually only gave like 4 stars, and there are other books that I gave 5 stars to at the time of reading them, but they just haven't like lingered in my mind and in my thoughts and in my heart in the same way that these books have. And there are 10 of them. However, 2 of them share something pretty important in common, and that is that they are first books in their series, and I loved them. But I have since read subsequent books in those series, and I did not like those books very much at all. And I have read those sequels that I didn't like very much very recently. I read both of those in December. So I'm feeling a little bit salty about these 2 books, but I can't deny that these were 2 of my absolute highlights of 2022. And I'm hoping that after the dust settles, I can just look back on these 2 books much more fondly than maybe I currently do. The first one will be very obvious for anyone who watched my most recent vlog. That is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lin Tan. This was a debut fantasy novel in 2022, and it was the first in what was to be the Celestial Kingdom duology. And it's also inspired by Chinese mythology. It's a kind of retelling of the Mid-Autumn legend. And this is the kind of book that I don't normally necessarily love all that much. It is very fast paced and it's very plot driven. And I tend to be someone who prefers slow to medium paced, character driven books. But this just won me over. I had so much fun reading this. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This felt like a whirlwind of a read. There was so much plot jam packed into this that it just felt thrilling. In this story, we follow our main character, Xinyin, who is the daughter of the Moon Goddess. And the Moon Goddess in this world is actually held captive on the moon. And nobody knows that she has a daughter. So one day when Xinyin is sort of being found out, she has to flee the moon, leave her mother, and go and live amongst the other immortals in the Celestial Kingdom. And she has to disguise herself. And she has this choice between either just kind of like living a quiet life and just hiding away, or of trying to rise through the ranks and to find a way to free her mother and to return to her mother. And obviously this is an epic fantasy story, so she chooses the latter. And it is a very linear story. There's not much in the way of side plot or side characters. We just really are following Xinyin as she goes through a whole host of trials and competitions and wars to try and free her mother. There's political intrigue, there's a love triangle, there's just an awful lot going on. And I just loved it. And I really love Sue Lin Tan's writing. It's really beautiful, but it's also very direct and clear. And I think especially this year, as I've been getting more into fantasy, a lot of the fantasy that I have read is it feels kind of bloated, I suppose, could be one way to describe it. And to me, in the midst of delving into fantasy, this felt very refreshing. And I had an awful lot of fun with it, even if I did kind of hate the sequel. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the books that I loved. So another book that I really, really loved when I read it was The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first in the Broken Earth trilogy, which is like one of the most critically acclaimed modern fantasy series, I would say. I had tried a couple of N.K. Jemisin works before this and they didn't really work for me, but when I read this, I just fell utterly in love. I actually did a reading vlog where I did read a few N.K. Jemisin books, and this was amongst them, and I remember saying that this is what I wanted from fantasy when I decided to start reading fantasy. This was the fantasy book I was looking for, basically. This is so intense and it's kind of hard to describe without giving really important elements away. But basically this first story in particular is told from 3 primary perspectives. They're told from 3 different women who are different ages. The story starts when one of these women, Eason, who is the oldest, finds that her son has been murdered by her husband and he has also kidnapped their daughter. As the story continues, we learn that this world is a very active planet in terms of like the tectonic plates, and there has been some kind of like event in terms of the Earth itself that is what these people in this world call a 5th season, which is essentially an apocalypse. Basically, the book starts at the end of the world and it just gets worse from there. We also learn that there is a small percentage of people who live in this world who can influence and control the Earth itself and like the movement of the plates. These people are reviled and feared and heavily oppressed. So this is a story of systems of oppression and how they work both in everyday lives and on a larger scale to control. And it asks that if we know a system of oppression is wrong and harmful and unjust, what means do we think are acceptable to end that system? It's powerful, it's evocative, it's atmospheric, it just makes you think. The reveals and twists in this are unlike anything I've ever read. I honestly think that this is one of the best books I've ever read. I just thought it was masterful. It was one of those books that I read like with my jaw dropped. I cried. It was just an emotional roller coaster and I loved every single second of it. While I was hoping that this whole series would be a new favorite series, unfortunately, that is not the case. However, I still think that this has to be one of my favorite books of 2022. Another book that is the first in the series is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. This is the first in the Monk and Robot books. There's 2 out so far. I assume there are going to be more. I've read both of the ones that we currently have though. And this is cozy, hopeful science fiction, I would call it. It's set in a world that very nearly averted climate catastrophe by taking care of the planet. And there also exists sentient robots, although they have chosen to live in the wilderness away from humans. Our story follows Dex, who is a tea monk, who just feels like a little restless in the day-to-day monotony of their job. And so on a whim, they decide to venture into the wilderness and they end up becoming the first human to interact with one of these sentient robots in hundreds of years. And in this first story in particular, we just kind of like follow as this robot and this tea monk start to become friends, and it's just adorable. There's lots of really incredible, although very on the nose kind of exploration of what it is to be a person. Like, what is personhood? What is consciousness? And also like the meaning of life in the face of mortality. And I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. It was the perfect read at the perfect time for me. It was so beautiful and hopeful and uplifting, but in a very like honest kind of way. And it was just exactly what I needed, especially with, you know, some of the harder parts of this year involved both of my grandparents dying. And I read this kind of like around that time. And I don't know, I just found it very supportive. I felt like this book held me just when I needed it, and I loved it. If absolutely pressed to pick a favorite book of 2022, I think it would have to be Open Water by Caleb Azamar Nelson. This is just a short novella, but it was so impactful. I read this back in like January or February, and I have not stopped thinking about it since then. And I actually got this out from the library and loved it so much that I had to get myself a copy. This story primarily follows a black man living in London, and it is told from the second person perspective, which I know will not work for everybody, but I thought it was brilliantly done. He's from like a pretty middle class, well-educated background, and he's a very sensitive, artistic man. And this book follows primarily the relationship that he develops with a black woman living in London. And it's just gorgeous. The writing in this is some of the best that I've read. I loved it. It's so poetic and evocative and emotional. It's just gorgeous. This is not a romance in the traditional sense though, because primarily this is literary fiction and it is an exploration of the effects and impacts of racism on our main character. And that does include some direct racism that he himself experiences, but it's also just like living within a racist society and having to see racist stuff on the TV and overhearing things that have racist implications and all of that. Just like the everyday violence of racism and existing within a racist system and what that everyday violence does to a human soul. This is potent and heartbreaking and absolutely gorgeous in every sense of the word. This author is actually coming out with another book in 2023, I think around May, and that is absolutely my most anticipated release of 2023 by a country mile. This was a debut, and ever since I read it back in January, I wanted nothing more than to dive into more from this author because this was just such a standout read for me this year. And it's so short. I'm still in awe of how much emotionally and like thematically was packed into this in like 100 pages. Like, it's just incredible. Okay, a little over 150, but still absolutely masterful and a book I will never forget. So that was my early favorite of the year. My most recent favorite of the year has to be Just One Damn Thing After Another by Jodi Taylor. This is a ridiculous romp of a sci-fi novel that I just fell head over heels in love with. I read this in one afternoon. It's 400 pages. I read it in an afternoon. In this story, we follow Max, who's an archaeologist who ends up being like recruited into this secret society called St. Mary's. And St. Mary's is this institute of historical research, but instead of like doing the regular kind of historical research of archaeology and research, They instead travel back in time to witness events as they occurred. Of course, they don't call it time travel though. They call it investigating major historical events in contemporary time. And this just has so much personality to it. I love Jodie's writing, and it was so much fun. If this book was just the first 300 pages of this, I think this would have been far and away like a new favorite book for me, favorite of the year. The last 100 pages were still good, and I think they were more about setting up what is to come in the series, but they weren't as good as the first 300 pages. I was blown away in those first 300 pages. Traveling back to different eras and different events in time was just a blast. I love too, like, just the atmosphere of St. Mary's itself, and also the dynamic between the different people who work at St. Mary's. There's also a really fun romance in this. Basically, I laughed, I cried, I just had an absolute ball. And for Christmas, Blair did buy me the next 9 books in the series, so this is definitely something that I'm going to be reading a lot of in 2023. This next one isn't part of another series, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know that this book is a favorite book of the year, but the series, I've read 3 books so far, and it is definitely, as a collective, it is a highlight for me. And that is the Memoirs of Lady Trent by Marie Brennan. This is the first book, A Natural History of Dragons. I had so much fun with this book. This is like an historical fantasy story. It's set in basically like the equivalent of Victorian England, except it is a different world and they call it different things. And Isabella Trent is an elderly woman who is looking back on her life and telling us her life story. Like, these are her memoirs. And in this world, we learn pretty quickly that at the time of writing, she's actually quite an infamous woman. And in this first book, we learn how she had all of these expectations as a gentlewoman to be a certain way, act a certain way, and be interested in certain things. Primarily be interested in finding a husband, getting married, and having children. However, Isabella was a headstrong young woman who had an obsession, a passion, a love for dragons, which in this world are real. And so we watch as she finds ways to learn more about dragons and to eventually go around the world and study dragons, and ends up becoming the foremost expert on dragons. And this series is just sort of like different periods of her life and different expeditions that she goes on. And it's just so fun. I love her narrative voice. It's so playful, and it's an elderly woman who gives no fucks. She does not care, and she's going to tell her story the way she wants to tell it. I love too how she sort of assumes that we know her. Like, in this world, she's so well known that she assumes that we know certain things, or that we've read other books that she's written. And so in this, she's kind of telling us the juicy, gossipy details that she's never been able to reveal before. And it's just so fun. There's also an awful lot of heart to it too that I really appreciate. And I just have had such a good time with this. This is a series that has quickly become a favorite for me. And when I'm like having a bad day, or I'm sort of like not too happy with my reading, this is a series I like just want to go to just feel rejuvenated and cozy and have a good time. It's just reliably going to be a good read for me, I suppose is what I'm saying. And like I said, although I don't know that any particular book in the series so far has become like individually a favorite or a standout, the series definitely has. And I think primarily that is just because I love Isabella Trent as a character so much. So although I definitely have been very disappointed by some fantasy series this year, this one has definitely been a standout, and one I'm so glad to have found. The only graphic novel I wanted to put on this list was Guardians of the Louvre by Jiro Taniguchi. Jiro Taniguchi is probably my favorite mangaka. Ferrari is my favorite manga of all time. Blair bought me this for my birthday. And this is definitely very reminiscent of Jiro Taniguchi's style of being very slice of life, very mundane, and finding the magical and the beautiful in the regular world. The Louvre actually commissioned a bunch of like art books done by different mangakas and artists, and this was Jiro Taniguchi's offering. This is the only one of that series that I've read, and I just loved it. It basically follows this man who is like visiting the Louvre for like a work trip or something, but he's come down with a fever and he hasn't been able to explore the Louvre as much as he'd like. And basically we follow him in a fever dream as he does explore the Louvre, and he meets like the ghost or the spirit of the Louvre, the guardian of the Louvre, who tells him the history of the Louvre and of the art pieces. So we get a little history lesson in this kind of like quirky magical realism sort of way that is honestly just really touching and really beautiful. It is all full color, this entire book, which is just an absolute delight. Jiro Taniguchi's artwork is just so beautiful. I suppose at the end of the day, Jiro Taniguchi's work, when it's at its best, and I do think that this is an example of him at his best, it just makes me love and appreciate the world a little bit more. And that's just something so special that a book can give you that gift. So this definitely has to be a favorite of the year. I loved this. Then finally, a totally left of field pick. When I read this book earlier in the year, I did not think it was going to make some end of year list. But I have not stopped thinking about this book since I read it back in like March, I think. And that is Temporary by Hilary Lecter. This book was just bonkers. This is an example of a lit fic kind of book that takes a concept and just runs with it, but does it so well and importantly, without overstaying its welcome. In this story, we follow a temp worker. She is one of those people who just like fills in for different random jobs. But this book takes that concept of the temp worker in late stage capitalism to its like most absurd endpoint. It starts reasonably mundane and we watch as she sort of gets office jobs, but as the book progresses, the jobs and the requirements of those jobs get more and more absurd. I didn't really understand the project of this book at the beginning. I'd say like the first third of the book, I was like into it, but not really into it, if you know what I mean. But there was one point in the book that just sort of like everything clicked, and I just found this both terrifying and hilarious in the best way. It's just one of those books that takes a small element of our current societal experience and just like amplifies it to hold up a mirror to how absurd some of the things that we do and believe and that we perpetuate really are. And in particular, this book is taking a look at our current understanding and framework of work under capitalism. And through this absolutely ridiculous lens, we also have questions raised about the meaningfulness of human life, the value we are providing to our community and to our capitalist overlords, and also how all of that affects our relationships and our interpersonal experiences too. It's basically this lit fic dystopia that is played off almost as a comedy, and the result is just one that I have not stopped thinking about in months. It's absolutely ridiculous and brilliant, and after all this time, I have to finally admit that I love this book and it is one of my favorites of the year, even if I didn't realize it back then. The last two books I actually don't own. I don't have here to show you. The first I got out at the library. That was The Past is Red by Catherine M. Valente. Again, this is another one that although I enjoyed it when I read it, I do not think that I thought that it was going to make some end of year list, but it's one that I just have not stopped thinking about. This is another one that is a little bit of a dystopian kind of tale, but it doesn't feel dystopian in our like traditional YA interpretation of that. It's a novella set about 100 years after the climate collapse of Earth. And after the melting of the ice caps and all of that, Earth is mostly now just water that is except for a very large patch of garbage on the ocean. And that is where the remaining people and animals happen to live. In this story, we follow our main character, Tetley, who is the most hated person on Garbage Town. And this is just a really unique look at humanity and our possible near future, but it's just a very different take than I've seen done before. Like, obviously it's not hopeful in the sense that we did not avert climate catastrophe in this world, but at the end of the day, there are still a very small number of people who have survived. And we see as they just sort of like get on with life. I really love Tetley and getting to know her and her story, but my favorite thing about this book and the thing that has stayed with me is like the visual image of this garbage patch and the fact that nothing new can be made for these people anymore. It's just literally the stuff and the crap from our society that is left. It basically just made me think about all of our stuff in a new way, in a way that is so obvious, but we just don't visualize very often. And that is like that most of the stuff that I own will outlive me. And what happens to it when I'm gone? On Garbage Town, some of the stuff that I think of as junk is valued in an entirely new way. And other stuff that I greatly value is now like people don't even know what it's used for anymore. It was just a really unique, unusual, beautiful book that was so immersive and honestly captivating. Again, it was like a 4-star read. I really liked it, but the way that it's just stayed with me and certain visuals and ideas and like questions that it left me with. One of my favorite things about reading is that books can do that to us, and that is why this book has just kind of like risen in my estimation over the year. It might not have been my favorite whilst I was reading it, but it is one of the books that I'll continue to think about for a really long time. And then finally, Restitative by Toni Morrison. And in particular, I'm talking about the edition that I read, which is the new release with the foreword by Zadie Smith. The reason I don't have this is because I listened to this on audiobook through Libro FM. And this is a very short story by Toni Morrison. I've only read one other Toni Morrison, and that was The Bluest Eye, which I found very impactful, but was harrowing to read read. So although like I have in my head that I want to read more Toni Morrison, I honestly haven't been like super keen to dive headfirst in, you know? But a short story I felt like I could do. And this short story, although it is challenging and it has its darker moments, this is less like a harrowing character tale and more an experiment on the reader. Basically in this story we're introduced to two young girls and we watch as they develop a friendship, and then as that friendship sort of disintegrates, and then as they come back together later in life. We follow these two people throughout a good chunk of their life, and we watch as they interact with the world and with each other and how they change over time. Importantly, we know that one of these girls is black, one of these girls is white, but we as the reader are never told which is which. Both race and class are massive themes throughout this story, but like that kind of trick that Toni Morrison plays on you in not knowing which girl is black and which girl is white is just a really curious and engaging way to experience a story, because it makes you reflect as a reader about the way that you are interpreting and you are coding these characters. To be fair, I do think as an Australian, I did have a different experience of this book than I think most Americans would. There's just so much about race and class that is different in Australia than it is America. But I still just loved sitting back and just like watching Toni Morrison craft this story of uncertainty and ambiguity. And I just loved what that did for me as a reader in highlighting these signifiers and these influences of race and class on these two characters. And as much as I really enjoyed the short story by Toni Morrison, I think what elevated this whole experience for me to another level was Zadie Smith's foreword. I think the combination of those two coming together and the way that Zadie really kind of like explored the history of this story and how it's been interpreted by other people and her own interaction with the story, I don't know, just kind of like elevated the whole experience for me. And the minute that I finished the audiobook, I hit replay. I started right from the beginning with Zadie's foreword all over again. It was just a really powerful and memorable experience. And I do think of this book more as an experience than like a reading journey or a book almost, if that makes sense. And in some ways, I think that's kind of what Toni Morrison was intending. So those are my 10 favorite or most memorable books that I read in 2022. If you'd like to hear about some of my other favorite books from this year and you haven't already checked out my YA, middle grade and junior fiction favorites, I'll leave links to those videos in the description box below for you. I would love to hear in the comments which books from 2022 really stayed with you, and if those books are a little bit different from your favorite or your most highly rated from the year, like they are for me. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon for all of your support, and especially big thank you goes to Olivia, Lynette Brown and Marie. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you again very soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye.